Hello, and welcome to another episode of What's the Point, where we talk about economic development in Wyoming. Many of you have seen the triangle framework that we talk about that really hopefully develops that local capacity and leads economic growth in Wyoming. And at the Business Council, we do that from levers of policy, investments, and leadership. I'm Josh Durrell, and with me today is Eric Protzer. He is a senior research fellow at the Growth Lab at Harvard's Kennedy School. And we're really excited to talk with him because of some work he's doing with us on the Pathways to Prosperity, which is an exciting project for us. And I want to just take a quick moment and talk a little bit about that, because I think a lot of people think of this as this is a report that's going to tell us exactly what to do and give us the roadmap to prosperity. And what I want to highlight is that it's not that at all, actually. I shouldn't say at all, because there is some of that. But really what it is, it's about action, and it's about the process that we will take from hopefully now until a long time into the future to continually evolve our policies around economic development and making our community stronger. And again, it's really about that action. I think that that's something that we're really working hard at the Business Council to do. It's something that the governor has asked us to be specific about and create action, not plans. And I think that that's why this work with Harvard is so exciting, is because it's a little bit of planning and it's a lot of action that will help us develop a better plan. So Eric, thanks for joining me today.
Well, thank you so much for having me here today, Josh. Yeah.
All right. Well, let's talk a little bit about you and the Harvard Growth Lab, and just tell me a little bit about what you've done and how you've done work around the world and what that's meant.
Absolutely. So at the Harvard Growth Lab, like you said, we're a research program that's within the Harvard Kennedy School. And we like to think of ourselves as people who solve economic growth problems. And we mean that in practice, and we mean that actually solving them, not just figuring out how to solve them. So it's very action oriented, as you said. So when we go to a place, we do need to spend a little bit of time doing analysis just so we figure out what's the growth problem, the economic growth problem in the place we're working in, what are some of the opportunities for the economy going forward, and what are some of the biggest barriers to getting to those destinations you want to get to. But then we're really emphatic about making sure that we drive very hard to actually implement those policy changes that can lead to better economic growth. We've worked in cities and states and countries on every inhabited continent. The kind of policy changes we pursue are really specific to the place that we're working in, because problems are different in different places. Some examples in other places we've worked, we've done things like create investment boards that drive FDI, things like reforms to high-skilled immigration, and also things like rethinking how an export sector is organized in order to drive export growth. So it really depends, but the point is that we figure out what to do, but then we help the partners that we're working with actually try to do that.
Right. And I think that's the part that's super exciting to all of us, is that idea that we're going to learn along the way, and we're not going to get some roadmap that may or may not work. It's going to be developed as we develop it. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
To evolve. Exactly.
Yeah. So it's a 16-month. As you know, we're partnering with the Business Council. It's a 16-month project from start to finish. We kicked off just a couple of months ago in August. It's going until January 2024. But yeah, we spent a couple of months figuring things out, and then very quickly we start to move into toward how can we actually make a tangible difference in the economic environment.
Right. And so that will obviously take some time, but your initial work has been spread around the state. You've been going around the state, meeting with a lot of businesses, trying to understand what might be a positive deviant, what might be a something that is understanding the constraints that a certain area might have, and also looking at data sets that maybe we don't always have access to or we don't know about, right? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I've now been to Wyoming once a month, every month for the past 3 months. So I've been getting around a little bit. We've been to, of course, we're talking here in Laramie right now. I've been to Laramie and Cheyenne and Casper, Sheridan, Gillette. Some of my colleagues have been down to Rock Springs and Kemmerer. I even stopped in Jackson for a conference. So we've been in all different parts of the state trying to talk to businesses and figure out what are some of the constraints that you're seeing in the business environments in Wyoming and even in the local area you're operating in. We typically, what we do is we take that as a starting point, as like a collection of well-informed hypotheses, right? And then, like you said, we then go to the data and then we try to figure out, well, can we actually prove this hypothesis, right? Can we prove that some particular area is potentially an issue in Wyoming? So, one example that we're starting to think about, we don't have all the evidence yet, but something that we've heard a lot from different businesses in Wyoming is that they're struggling with workforce issues because they can't always house people, right? So we try to look for some constraint in the system that could correspond to that, where there's high demand, low supply, indicates there's some kind of blockage that's not getting solved. And it turns out, if you look at the data, that every single county in Wyoming, for example, in 2019, had a median house price that was above what you would statistically expect given how many people lived there. So that's some start of an indication of a blockage. But we're going to think of every aspect of the economy and figure out where are those pain points that are preventing the leap to the next opportunity.
So let's talk about that, not as not as housing as a specific issue,
sure,
which we could, but really more of okay, so there's this issue. We'll call it housing. And I think a lot of people will say, oh, well, housing is our issue.
Sure,
and it's like,
sure.
But is that really the issue? And so I think talking about how do we dig a little bit deeper to understand what the true constraint is.
Sure,
is it the home prices are higher than what you would expect? Yeah. Is it that developers need a certain ROI and a certain number of a certain amount of demand to come?
Yeah.
Is it the permitting process? What are all of these factors, and how do we address the one that's hampering growth the most? Right?
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, housing is just one example. There are other issues in the state, but you're exactly right. You got to really drill down and figure out where exactly is that opportunity, and where exactly are those constraints. Yeah.
And so you do a combination, right, of analyzing the data that you have, but also with some of the discussions and interviews that you've done to really kind of dig in. Now, how do we? One of the things that we want to do is build that local capacity.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And so developing policies is a huge, that's a great thing. We want to do that. So working with legislators, developing programs, whatever it might be to develop policies that the state can use to get rid of some of those growth constraints.
Sure. Yeah.
But the other part that is sort of almost more exciting to me is this idea that we can empower our communities to go through the same process and teach them. How do you ask those deeper questions? How do you bring in the right stakeholders and truly understand a problem before you start iterating at all? So is that something that you've seen as you've maybe left an area that the process lives on, and really that can create just as much change as the recommendations make?
Yeah, I think so. We use a specific phraseology when we talk about that. We talk about high bandwidth organizations, and I mean it's kind of just a fancy name, but what it really means is that if you want to be an economic development organization of any kind that is actually going to really solve problems, you need to get this process in place where you're talking to people in your community who you serve, and you're gathering data based on what they're saying to really analyze where are those pain points, and then you go and you try to solve them. So you formulate, well, what's the problem? And then you try to figure out where is maybe an entry point where I can try to begin to solve the problem. Right. You organize stakeholders around that. Sure. You try and take action, and then you take stock and you see how did it go. And you keep iterating. But the important thing is to make sure you're going through that entire loop of information processing, rather than just saying, I think it's this, and saying, hey, I'm just going to charge ahead with this and ignoring other possibilities. It's about getting that information processing organization in place to figure out where are the problems and how can we try and solve them.
Yeah. So one of the things that I love that framework, and if you get a chance, rewind it, listen to how he walked through that, and listen to it again and again, because it's a really good way to solve problems. And the only challenge that I see with that is humans. Right? We love to jump to conclusions. We love to jump to solutions. So where have you seen that sort of instituted, or where is that done really well, so that people can go through that process and utilize it for its power? And not feel like they have to jump ahead? Or how do they instigate change with all those stakeholders, knowing that there's a lot of pressure to solve problems, right? Everybody wants a solution, and not spend the time on the process to solve it. So, can you talk a little bit about that? Or
No, that's true, and people do feel that kind of pressure. I mean, one example that I felt was really successful in the Growth Lab, and this was actually some of my colleagues that did this, but it was an example we keep coming back to. It's that export processing thing I was mentioning earlier, and this was in actually Albania. And they had, essentially a group of people that was a certain organization within the government that was in charge of thinking about how to organize exports and how to streamline exports. And they had this opportunity that they weren't essentially taking advantage of. And it was because, in part, they weren't figuring out how to get that information processing system in place. And the Growth Lab, worked in Albania for a number of years and implemented this process, helped them to figure out how do you do that. And it's not instantaneous. You got to teach people how to really do it, and it takes some practice. But once it was in place, the export growth that resulted from that, it was in this export processing sector related to garments and leather. It shot through the roof. Like there was a lot, millions of dollars of export growth as a consequence. So right. It's absolutely, you're absolutely right. It's a tough thing to do. You've got to sort of go against a lot of human instinct. But if you can really carefully get that in place and just try to explain to people what you're doing and how that'll drive good outcomes and good economic growth, then that can be really helpful, I think.
Great.
Yeah.
Great. So earlier we were talking about a particular topic that we care a lot about in Wyoming, and that is our natural resources.
Sure, yeah.
And you think about especially the extraction industry.
Yeah.
Right? We have a lot of those. We're very, very dependent upon those.
Yeah.
Very thankful for them. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that people will come to us all the time and say is, okay, well, if we could just get some more of the downstream value add from those industries, then that's going to help us. And
right,
it's hard to disagree with that.
Right.
Like that makes sense on paper. It's not always as easy in practice because of the economics. But you mentioned something that was pretty eye-opening to me, and I think pretty exciting because it went in a slightly different direction than that whole, well, we've just got to work on the value add downstream, and if we do that, then everything will be better. Yeah. You talked a little bit more about what was going on kind of at the mouth of the mine, if you will, right?
Sure,
What could happen. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is something that we hear in a lot of places, and I'm actually from a former coal mining town of 3,000 people in rural Canada myself, so I get it, and I get the enthusiasm for that kind of thing. And we see in various places we work a lot of enthusiasm for, okay, well, we've got this natural resource. Can we just do additional things to it and try to make it into something more value added? And realistically, it doesn't always pan out. And there are actually important reasons why. So, one classic example of how this works in practice is that if you think of which country makes the best chocolate, it's probably Switzerland, right?
Yeah,
Now the thing is, they don't grow the chocolate plant in Switzerland at all. Right. No, it's from all these tropical countries. And so, there's sort of this question of, well, okay, how is that the case? Like, why on earth are they doing this in Switzerland? And why are they doing this to such a high degree of efficiency and quality and not in the places where they're actually growing it? Like, surely it should cost a bunch of money to send it there. And the reason why that occurs is actually, we argue, due to sort of the nature of how knowledge and how technology operates in the economy. Okay. So we talk a lot about this concept called know-how, and it's one of these different types of knowledge, right? Okay. So there's different types of knowledge in the economy, and we say there's three different types. Okay. So one type of knowledge is knowledge that is being physically embodied into something. And that we call tools. So, whether you make a machine or even just a simple tool, it's something where, okay, you know how to make it. Now you've embodied it into something so that somebody else can come and use that.
Can use it, right?
Yeah. And another type of knowledge is codes. So that's something like a blueprint or even just a formula, a description of something, how something works. But then the third type of knowledge is something called know-how, and that is like tacit, practical knowledge that is in people's brains. And the reason why know-how is so important in determining how economic diversification and economic development happens is because the other two types of knowledge, codes and tools, those are really easy to transfer across different places, right? So you know, there's sort of this overarching question in the world economy and world economic development of, if technology is such a key driver of economic growth, and it's so easy to transmit knowledge, like you just read a book or learn in a classroom, why doesn't it spread to more places? Why don't you have technology being pursued all over the place? And it's not because of the tools, which are easy to ship anywhere. It's not because of the codes, where you can just, you know, print out a blueprint or a formula and give it to someone. It's because of the know-how. The practical stuff that you've got to know how to actually do something in practice. And that is really hard to teach. That's why you have things like medical teaching hospitals, for example, or that's why you have apprenticeship programs, because it is so important to get people to actually know not just how something works in principle, or, you know, being able to pick up a tool, but actually getting that experience doing something. So the reason, coming back to the example of these chocolatiers in Switzerland, the reason that those chocolatiers are in Switzerland and not in somewhere like Ghana is because they have the know-how, they have the expertise of that artistry of being able to make the chocolate so well and so efficiently that they've cultivated for a very long time. And there are, you know, plenty of tropical countries that grow the chocolate that are wanting to do that. And they find it very difficult to get to the next stage because they don't have the know-how. That is so hard to tell somebody. It's because it is that sort of intuitive knowledge that you almost don't even know it's there. It's like almost part of your subconscious, right? And how do you teach that to somebody else?
Except by doing.
Yeah, exactly. So in the case of a place like Wyoming, where there is a bunch of discussion about adding value to your raw materials, the thing is that if you want to add value to your raw materials, you're competing against every other place that has know-how on how to do that and has the ability to ship that raw material into wherever they are. And we see that happen in natural resource extraction in different places. We've seen it, for example, in Western Australia, where they actually have laws so that they have to keep some of the natural gas in Western Australia that they produce in order to try and do things downstream. It doesn't really work because there are these other places that have know-how and they can just buy the natural gas. But the upstream stuff that you were mentioning earlier, that is where stuff gets really interesting. And I think in Wyoming there is potential because that's where you get know-how developing. So, you know, there are plenty of outfits in Wyoming that are known for servicing the mining industry in certain ways through things like fabrication and repair. I mean, think of, you know, probably L&H is like one of the classic examples operating up in Gillette, right? Now, the thing is that, and we've seen this in Wyoming in several companies, you get this story where you have companies start off servicing the mining industry and they get that expertise. They build up that know-how in knowing how to fabricate things, knowing how to repair things, often on machines that are incredibly large, incredibly expensive. And the thing is, once you've got that base of know-how, that is a competitive advantage that other people will have. They'll have a really hard time acquiring that because it's not easily transmissible. So that is something that is really incredibly valuable to your economy. And we've seen that in practice being used as a basis to then launch into other industries as a means of adding, you know, additional activities, additional perspectives into your economy. So you know, some of the outfits in Wyoming, for example, that started working servicing the mining industry. Of course, like now some of them are even doing things with like spacecraft. I mean, it's and aeronautics, advanced aeronautics. It's pretty incredible. But it's because of that story of the know-how, the tacit knowledge that is so important.
And they're not commoditizing what they do and trying to race to the bottom. They're keeping it high value and saying, hey, let's keep what we have special. Let's make sure that we can charge a premium for that know-how and go after industries where they're not as price sensitive, right? I mean, that's another thing it's pretty exciting to hear somebody like Mike Wandler talk about that. He says, look, logistics out of Wyoming are different than logistics if you're in San Francisco,
Sure.
right?
Sure.
But because we're doing something that's high value and we've chosen
Yeah.
our markets carefully and we've
Mhm.
chosen the areas in which we play carefully, we can pull it off
Yeah.
because they're not as price sensitive. So not only did he have the know-how, then he used kind of the business smarts to say, let's not try to scale this know-how and race to the bottom where it's a commodity.
Yeah,
Let's
exactly.
keep it up high and get high value for what we create.
Yeah, absolutely. And, it depends a lot on, I guess, the kind of know-how that you're trying to pursue, right? But if you are dealing with, these enormous operations where you're not just making some, cheap little thing, you're really doing
Right.
some serious high quality work there, and you're cultivating that know-how. It's like you said, it allows you to be able to work for quality and a premium, and it means you're not playing the race to the bottom anymore. You can go and you can do those advanced things in aeronautics and spacecraft, like these incredible things that are starting to happen in parts of the Wyoming economy.
Yeah, an idea that's not necessarily for Wyoming, but kind of popped in my head when you thought about tools and codes and then know-how. And, you think about an aircraft wing, right?
Sure,
The tools to make an aircraft wing, those are machines that are available.
Yeah,
The most folks that are in engineering, they understand the Bernoulli equation,
Yeah.
right? Like, so that's
Yeah.
But then the know-how to build aircraft wings,
Exactly.
only a few companies in the world have it to do it right.
That's exactly right.
And I think that's one of the things that you could see that, but maybe at a smaller scale, I think about how do areas of the country or areas of our state innovate and sort of cluster and then grow.
Yeah.
And I think about know-how in that way.
Yes, for
And,
sure.
And so where are there examples, and maybe
Uh-huh.
they're and they don't have to be in Wyoming. I think
Sure,
I might have an
sure.
example for Wyoming, but are
Okay.
there examples where that know-how was sort of imported to an area and then it ballooned out?
Oh yeah, I mean there are some famous ones in the economic development sort of academic literature. So like probably the most famous one that I can think of is the Bangladeshi textile industry. So
Okay.
it sounds a bit specific, but it's actually really cool. So in Bangladesh, essentially historically for a long time they were really trying to figure out, well, how can we, get some a garment sector, a textile sector going, making clothes and things like that to export in order to get some income, get some jobs for people. And they were really, really struggling with it for a long time. But the critical thing that changed them, and it was a huge explosion, was that they finally got some FDI from a South Korean group. And the South Koreans had already been through that process and they knew how to do that. And they came there and they spent all this time figuring out, helping them figure out, how do you actually set this up? Can we train workers? Can we give them the practice so that they can get the know-how to actually know how to do this? And they started that with just, one sort of small set of factories from one company investing, right? Well, then the classic thing sort of happened where you have a couple of the guys who started off in that, a couple of the local Bangladeshi guys, and they said, hey, wait a minute, now I know how to do this. And so they started off and they spun out and they made their own factories because they had the know-how to do so. And it absolutely exploded. It propelled the Bangladeshi textile sector into being one of the most successful instances of economic acquisition of an industry, economic diversification in contemporary history.
Wow.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking of something on a smaller scale.
Sure.
But we had a company in the center of the state.
Yeah.
It did a specific thing. It did it really, really well. It brought in some talent. It continued to grow talent through like apprenticeships and transferring that know-how by doing, right? You don't even know that it's coming, but you got it.
Yeah.
And that company continued to grow for quite a while, and then it sort of changed course and it changed directions. And some of the folks who were there did the same thing. They said, hey, wait a second, we could do a company doing this. And another one said, well, I've got some other offshoot that could do this. And pretty soon that one company turned into four companies.
Sure, yeah.
Almost overnight.
Yeah.
And not I think by transferring that know-how, by importing it and then transferring that know-how.
Yeah.
And now all of those companies, of course, when you move to Wyoming, you want to live in Wyoming, right?
Yeah.
You want to stay in Wyoming. And
Yeah.
so they've all stayed in Wyoming,
Yeah.
but they've created their own companies. And I think that's another another way to help people understand how to kind of continually grow our economy and grow our communities in the way that makes sense to us.
Yeah, absolutely.
And kind of by transferring that know-how. And it's
Yeah.
it's really hard to show that to people because it's unseen.
Yeah, exactly. It's that unconscious knowledge, right?
Yeah.
But it is so important to the economic, diversification, like adding new industries. That's how it happens. It's through the tacit knowledge of people practically knowing how to do something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty kind of like a fantastic idea to think about, because as we look at how do we develop a cluster, or how do we bring in that know-how, and then how do we instigate it?
Yes,
right?
exactly.
How do we take what the government could do, for example, to instigate it? Like, what is stopping us now, and understanding that constraint to growth,
Exactly,
and then addressing it to kind of kick that on. That's a cool opportunity, and that's
definitely
that's an area that the Pathways Project is.
That's exactly right. Yeah. I was just about to mention that. So I mean, one of the major things that we do is that we don't just think about this know-how thing in theory. We like to practically do it, right?
Yeah.
So we have all these data science tools to try and figure out, if you have this combination of industries that's already in a place, what can you do next? And the way the algorithm works is it essentially looks at comparable places and what they've done, when they were in similar situations to where you are now, and that gives you kind of some guidance on okay, what are industries that use similar know-how to the know-how that exists in your economy. And that's something we're definitely very excited about doing in the case of Wyoming. We're putting together data that is at it's at the county level, covering all of Canada and the US and Mexico, putting that through a huge algorithm, figuring out where those opportunities are. And then, like you said, really spending a lot of time trying to figure out, okay, well, if there is this opportunity, what's the constraint that's preventing it from happening? Because you have these instances where even in some surrounding states around Wyoming, there are some instances of some towns where, for their size, they are remarkably economically diversified, more than you would expect. And those are sort of the case studies almost, right? You want to figure out how did they build that know-how to go to the next place. What were the blockages in place that maybe Wyoming could solve to create those clusters of economic activity here? Yeah.
And so when you talk about these, like these data sets and the algorithms that are going to analyze that, I mean, those will ultimately be tools that we can then use, right? To instigate that, right?
Yes.
And that we'll be able to develop policy around that. And when I say policy there, I mean it in a much more broad sense than just some laws. Those are part of it, but also programming that we might do, investments that we might make.
Exactly.
The way we utilize other funding to get some of these things done.
Yeah.
And so one of the things, and straight up, it's when you say you're from Harvard, well people they're like, wow, that's impressive, but also it seems like, gosh, how do I use it if I'm a kid from Rawlins, Wyoming? How do I use this? And what I've seen so far is that you make it really accessible.
Yeah, we do that. So something we do in a lot of our projects is we do try to make it very, very accessible by developing these kind of dashboards, like it's basically like a digital tool. And that way, when you're dealing with this thing, you don't have to go and enter 100 lines of Python code or whatever. You can just use this thing where we've distilled it down. And since we've spent some time here, we can tell people the principles, the ideas of how things work. But then we hand you off this dashboard, and you can typically just use that and look up yourself. Well, what are the opportunities that are closest to where you are right now? Yeah.
And so we're in this really interesting spot, right? We're traditionally a pretty boom and bust.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
But we're also in a spot right now where we've just come out of a bust, and as we were talking today about like the level of diversification in our economy, it's actually the highest maybe ever been at this time, which is still not compared to other states. It's not where we want it to be.
Sure, but that's still a good sign.
It's a great sign, right? And we're also coming out of, we've had a couple great years from minerals, and so the state has a little bit of money, and I guess we're in this spot where I feel like we need to sort of double down, not say, oh, well, we made it through it. We're all fine. Because I want to get to a spot where we're in an and situation, right? We have all of these industries that we've kind of instigated and started, and we have the natural resources that we have.
Exactly.
And so have you been in a situation where, maybe a country or a city or a state said, That's all fine and good, but we're better now. And then, of course, they go back to the way they were, and the change didn't stick. How have you seen that?
I have. So, we've worked, for example, in Western Australia, and in some respects, there are some similarities with Wyoming. It's a very mineral-dependent economy. In their case, it's iron ore, so it's something that it's not the same as the fossil fuel cycle, but there are booms and there are busts, and the effect of global demand from China is still very important. And to begin with, when we got there, we always had to be very emphatic explaining that when we talk about economic diversification, we don't mean replacing, we mean adding to the economy. It's that "and" that you're talking about, right? Now, unfortunately, and when we did this project in Western Australia, it was right before the pandemic hit.
Right.
And understandably, when that happens, priorities shift. So,
Absolutely.
it was just damage control. And right now, it's still a fantastic place to live in. I think it's a really, beautiful part of the country. It's got high quality of life and everything like that. But I wish that we could go back and we could say, okay, well, now that you've got, this damage control underway, it's really important to think about the long-term future of, can you have that, and can you have your mineral economy, and there's that's fantastic,
Right.
Undeniably, but can you have that and situation of also having these diversified set of industries that are going to allow you to say smooth over the busts, that kind of thing.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that's exactly it, right? We know
Exactly.
that those are going to happen.
Yeah.
But how do we make the impacts felt much less?
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, like, the last 10 years in Wyoming, on some indicators, there were losses of jobs, losses of employment, losses of social mobility, especially in really small towns. Like, those were the hardest hit ones. The
Right.
small towns were the ones that lost the most population, the most jobs. It would be great if you could smooth that over. And it doesn't mean you get rid of what you do. It means you add to what you do.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And that's a key element in our state's economic development strategy.
Yeah.
Right. Is
Yeah.
to say, what we have, is really important. And
Yes.
adding value to those core
Yes.
industries is important.
Yeah.
But we've got to leverage the strengths we have to activate those new sectors.
Yeah.
And I think
Yeah.
your example about utilizing know-how
Yeah.
for somebody like an LNH to do
Exactly.
that is a key component. And
Yeah.
I think sometimes we get so wrapped up in thinking, well, we've got to protect what we have so much
Sure.
that
Yeah.
we don't realize that sometimes the best way to protect that is by branching out, is by looking at other things and adding them to what we already do.
Absolutely. I don't think that branching out in that way is actually threatening mining at all. I mean, it's a natural outgrowth of it. It's that you've got this natural resource. You've spent generations servicing that. You've got the know-how of how to service that industry, and you can use that know-how that's been built up over generations to now do these additional incredible things. Like aeronautics, space, like these incredibly sexy things.
Yeah.
And that is not in any way detracting from the mineral economy.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. And I think one of the things that I'm really excited about this is the action part.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah.
So not sitting back, waiting and saying, here's the report now, Wyomingites, go for it, make it happen.
Yeah.
But really kind of instigating some of those and running those.
Yeah.
Say, okay,
Yeah.
we had an hypothesis, we put some data toward it, we looked at what our constraint is, but it's at that level, it's just a well-formed hypothesis, and maybe it's got some backing, but it's still a test, right?
Yes.
And going out there, doing that, running it, learning from it, and doing it again.
Yes.
Kind of again,
Yes.
instilling that process into the economic landscape. Now, how? And this is a question I don't know if you and I have talked about.
Sure.
How do we square that with a policy and a government that maybe doesn't run at the speed of business? It does its best. It's fast.
Yeah.
You don't want to put in a law and then immediately change it, right?
Yeah.
So you've got to, how do you square that pacing so that you can iterate while at the same time have some of that, not stability, but give a law time to work, or give a program time to work. So how do you do that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think realistically, you have to be careful about how you balance your capacity and your resources, and you have to make sure that you're being very deliberate about not just waiting like I don't know, some short period of time to evaluate whether something works, but you've got to properly give it a chance. So I think, I mean, you're right that government does not move at the speed of business, but nevertheless, you can still have, these cycles where maybe you can't address, 100% of every single issue going down the laundry list. Yep. But I think actually what's really important is not to address like every single of hundreds of possible issues. It's to address the top couple of most painful ones. Those are really, it tends to be the most painful handful of issues that are the ones that make the biggest difference if you can actually solve those.
If you can solve them.
Yeah. So that's I think part of the reason why it's possible to do this. Maybe you work over a couple of years. You don't do something in like a couple of months, like a business might. But if you do that in a really organized, really deliberate way, where you're solving some of the biggest constraints, you get that information, you identify what is the biggest pain point that businesses are facing, and you work really hard on that problem, and then you work really hard trying to measure what happened, over not just some short period of time, but over however long it takes. Right. Yeah. So I think that's how you do it.
Let's talk really briefly, and then this will probably kind of get us to a good stopping point for this episode. We should do this again.
Yeah, we should.
As we progress.
Yeah.
But I want to talk a little bit about that whole idea of problem-driven, iterative approach.
Yeah, for sure.
And you kind of laid it out a little bit. One of the things that we tend to focus on, and we get this a lot at the business council, is like, hey, we got a project. We want you guys to fund a little bit of it, and then the project gets done, and everybody's happy, and everybody high fives, and then you sort of go away. And we do reporting and all of those things.
Sure,
right?
Sure, yeah.
But what I want us to sort of change that is that we don't come in at the project and see it get done and then have everybody be happy. But we really spend that time defining the problem, really understanding what it is, what is the constraint that we're solving, spend some time on the beginning, at the beginning of it. Then the project is a small piece of it. And then we spend that time analyzing, did it solve what we thought it would? How did it work well? How did it not work so well? So that we can use that shared knowledge, and so then it becomes maybe know-how, right? Eventually, where we can kind of repeat that process. And that's the part where I guess with the process that Pathways is starting to institute, and what we're really going after is utilizing the planning, the project, and then the post as really the whole thing is what we're going after, for sure, not just the project. And I think that's something that is pretty darn exciting to me.
Well, I'm glad you think so. Yeah, I mean, it's something we like to say about how we do things differently than some typical consultant, right? I mean, we're a research program. We don't do this for profit. We do it because we want to make a difference, and we're really emphatic about you got to get all those stages right. You do have to do the planning, but that's not the whole point. You gotta then implement it. You gotta evaluate it. The only thing I'd add is that this whole PDIA, problem-driven iterative adaptation. Don't worry. If anybody listening is interested in more, I'd encourage them to look up the specialists at Harvard who do this. Building State Capacity is the name of the organization where they do this, and they've got tons of great information if anybody just wants to learn more.
Absolutely. And I'm hoping folks will, because again, we'll be utilizing that. We'll be looking at ways to build that capacity, because ultimately what we want to do with this is not have a report that sits on a shelf, not have a report that we could have written in the 60s or 70s or 80s
for
or
sure,
whatever, but we have that process in place so that we can continue to use it. And Eric, I know that it's not just you at Harvard that's working on this. There's a big team of folks working on this. And but we sure appreciate your time today. And,
well, thank you. I appreciate it. And
I love the fact that you have a background in a coal mining town. I love the fact that that you've been to Wyoming so many times in the last few months, and it sounds like you've really kind of made your way around, and your team has too, and that makes a big difference, because we feel pretty darn special here in Wyoming, and we want to make sure we show that off. So thanks for being here.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Yeah, we're having a great time. It's something where the project means a lot to me personally because of the relationships there. So we're looking forward to the rest of the work.
Great.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks, Eric.
Thank you.